I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you news from the front lines as Russia seems to make gains in the Donbas, and we speak to our Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes about the intense diplomacy between Ukraine and NATO.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 3rd of July. 2 years and 135 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our assistant comment editor Francis Dearnley and Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes. I started by summarising the latest news from Ukraine. Ukraine launched an overnight drone attack targeting the Black Sea port of Novorossiysk, where what's left of Moscow's Black Sea fleet is hiding after it was forced to abandon its Crimean base in Sevastopol. Russian officials restricted beach access after reporting its defensive forces were engaged in repelling the drones and claimed to have destroyed the threat. Mayor Andriy Kravchenko said on Telegraph, quote, "We kindly request you to refrain from visiting beach areas, embankments and recreational areas along the water's edge during operational activities." The Russian Ministry of Defense claimed to have destroyed 12 drones launched at Russian territory. We've not heard comment yet from the Ukrainian side, so this is a story we will return to tomorrow. Another thing to note on this, that satellites have detected large fires in the area of the port, which is, of course, one of Russia's largest, and serves as a major outlet for crude oil and oil product and transit in Russia's south. Over Ukraine, Ukraine's Air Force said it had shot down 5 missiles and 6 drones on Wednesday morning. They claimed to have downed 1 Iskander-K cruise missile, 4 Kh-59 guided missiles, 5 Shahed-type drones, and 1 Orlan-10 reconnaissance drone in an attack that largely targeted Dnipropetrovsk region. The regional head described the barrage as, quote, massive, and posted images showing buildings ripped open by the attack and shattered glass strewn across the ground. This is what one of the city's shopping centres looked like now. Cars and windows were smashed, and a petrol station was hit. All the consequences are still being investigated. This is from Mykola Lukashuk. On to this morning, and strikes on the central Ukrainian city of Dnipro have killed at least 3 and injured 18 more. This is coming from local officials. Several explosions were heard in the city on Wednesday morning, and local media reported that a rocket had been launched through Zaporizhia in the direction of Dnipro. A woman was also injured in an early morning attack in the southern Ukrainian region of Kherson. Alexander Bakudin, the governor of Kherson, said that 1 person had been killed and 15 more injured in Russian attacks over the past day. Moving to the US, Washington has announced a new military aid package for Ukraine worth more than $2.3 billion. US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said the package will include anti-tank weapons and air defense interceptors and allow the procurement of the highly sought-after Patriot and NASAMS anti-missile systems. Make no mistake, Ukraine is not alone, Mr. Austin wrote on X. A couple of other stories before we go to Francis. Ukraine has launched a counterattack inside Russian-occupied southern Kherson on Wednesday. This is coming from a Kremlin-allied official. Vladimir Saldo, the Moscow-installed governor of Kherson, said Ukrainian forces used FPV drones to lead 2 separate attacks in the town of Alexei. 2 were killed and another injured, he said. Mr. Saldo also warned of a possible second attack, which he called the, quote, favourite tactic of Kyiv's forces. Of course, a reminder to take this sort of information with a rather large pinch of salt. Finally, this update harks back to a story in April, but a Ukrainian military spy official has said on Wednesday that a fire on a Russian warship in the Baltic Sea in April was caused by a joint operation conducted by his forces and a pro-Kyiv Russian military group. If we remember, on April 7th, footage showed a major fire on board the Serpukhov missile cruiser, stationed in the Kaliningrad region, that reportedly caused extensive damage to the warship. Now, Andrei Yusov, a spokesman for Ukraine's military intelligence agency, said the operation was conducted in tandem with the Freedom of Russia Legion. That's one of the Russian pro-Kyiv groups that was involved in the skirmishes around the southern border, or the northern border, Ukraine's northern border, Russia's southern border, in the past few months. Well, those are all the military updates. Francis, can I come to you? What have you been looking at diplomatically and politically?
Thanks, David. As we look ahead to the major NATO 75th anniversary summit next week, we're starting to hear details of what may or may not be offered to Ukraine. Laying the groundwork beforehand, Washington announced that new military aid package you've just discussed, of course, but there is no indication, vitally, that Ukraine will be invited to join the alliance, something Joe Barnes is going to discuss in detail shortly, as there are additional necessary steps which have just been laid out. A good summary of what we can expect from the summit more broadly, though, is in the Wall Street Journal, which reports from its sources that NATO will, amongst many other things, station a senior civilian official in Kyiv among a raft of new measures designed to shore up long-term support, seeking to buttress Ukraine's prospects to eventually join the alliance without offering membership at this stage. So it writes, the alliance will establish a new Command 2 in Germany to coordinate the provision of military equipment to Kyiv and the training of Ukrainian troops. The operation, to be called NATO Security Assistance and Training for Ukraine, will be staffed by nearly 700 US and other allied personnel from across the 32-country alliance. It will take over much of a mission that has been run by the American military since the full-scale invasion. Now, this fact is quite an important development, I would argue. There have been quite a lot of criticisms made about the lack of clear central coordination for the international war effort, somewhere that is a base, a go-to for that kind of work, not just in terms of procurement, but particularly for recovery too. It's noteworthy that during the era of the Marshall Plan, for instance, there was a very clear headquarters. That has been somewhat lacking. And so I think this is clearly designed to send a signal in that regard. The journal goes on. More widely, there is an expectation that the summit will also agree an annual financial pledge of military support to Ukraine, although terms are still under negotiation. Recent discussions among alliance members have included setting a goal of roughly $40 billion annually and increasing the value of many countries' contributions, though the US would likely continue to be a major donor. Lastly, in an effort to paper over differences within the alliance, officials say NATO is likely to describe Ukraine's bid to join NATO as irreversible, building on language in an alliance communiqué last year that Ukraine's future is in NATO, and a 2008 communiqué that said Ukraine would become a NATO member one day. But, and I imagine listeners can imagine where I'm going with this, critically, a lot remains in flux. Politico has just published an interesting piece today looking at the evolving situation in the United States, especially now that some experts are predicting an 80% chance of a Trump victory in November as things stand, and what that would mean for NATO. We have looked at this subject too, and our sources here at the Telegraph confirm that Trump is yet to formulate a core foreign policy team, but Politico speculates that the current understanding, based on those who are around him, is that we would expect a return for continued US participation to be predicated on European countries drastically increasing their spending on NATO, which of course was his main complaint as president, and also undertaking what one defence expert familiar with the thinking inside that advisory circle describes as a radical reorganisation and reorientation of NATO. So the US, under this proposal, again, this is not formal, but this is the speculation around what's being discussed at the moment. The US would keep its nuclear umbrella over Europe by maintaining its air bases in Germany, England and Turkey, and its naval forces as well. Meanwhile, though, the bulk of infantry, armour, logistics and artillery would ultimately pass from American to European hands. Interesting. It goes on. We could also see a two-tier NATO system emerge. The idea means that member countries that don't spend 2% of GDP on defence wouldn't enjoy the security guarantee of the US, whilst those that do would. Now, at the moment, of course, that would be seen as going in defiance of Article 5, as is widely understood. But here, too, there's room for what appears to be flexibility of interpretation. So apparently one member of this brain trust has noted that the language in Article 5 is flexible and doesn't require any and every member to respond with military force. So a different reading of Article 5, which is something we've talked about before. This idea that Article 5 is ironclad is simply not true. that it is subject of interpretation. Now, that interpretation has widely been pushed as being that an attack on one is an attack on all. But actually, Article 5 just predicates consideration of a suitable response. It doesn't mean that all of a sudden the aeroplanes are in the air as such. So a very interesting piece there in Politico and in the Wall Street Journal, as well as our own coverage, which Joe's going to talk about in a moment. But potentially some radical changes to the structure of NATO were Trump to win, but that won't be news to you at home. Now, in other stories, I think just the other one that's worth mentioning here today is Putin has arrived in Kazakhstan for regional security and defence talks, as well as talks with Chinese and Turkish leaders. This is part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, that forum established by China and Russia in the early noughties as a guardian of security in the Eurasia region. They're going to be meeting for their summit on July 3rd, 4th in Kazakhstan's capital. And the Kremlin have said the leaders of the SCO member countries will discuss the current state and prospects for further deepening multifaceted cooperation within the organisation and improving its activities. So far, so bland. But what's interesting, and this is why I mention it, is not so much that it's taking place, but the countries that are part of this and are part of the conversations. So let me see if I can list these all off in one go. So we've got Russia, China, Turkey, Azerbaijan, Belarus, India, Iran, Kazakhstan, Qatar, Kyrgyzstan, China, Mongolia, the UAE, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. They're all there. Whew, I didn't think I'd get them all off in one go. But yes, so an interesting list. Interesting to see India in there, Qatar in there, China, of course, being critical too. And just on that, I did note that it was quite interesting that the Finnish president used this week in an interview with Bloomberg to say that a single phone call between Xi and Putin would end the war in Ukraine. He said Russia is so dependent on China, one call would solve the crisis. If he were to say time to start peace, Russia would be forced to do that. They'd have no other choice. That's certainly one perspective, and I agree that it shows that the idea of China as a neutral actor in this war has not cut through, and many leaders do know exactly where China stands on this, despite what they might say. But I do wonder whether even this perspective slightly downplays the way in which Russian society has been transformed over the past 2 years by this war, and that Putin wouldn't just be able to turn it off very quickly. It would involve gradual steps, gradual elements, even if China were to say enough is enough. But that's where we are, David, in terms of some of the major political stories, though I know Joe is going to go into more detail about NATO and later Viktor Orban.
Well, brilliant. Thank you very much, Francis, and well done on that list of countries. You almost did it. Joe, you've written quite a story for The Telegraph. The first line, Ukraine will be told it is currently too corrupt to join NATO, in a major blow to Volodymyr Zelensky. Talk us through this story.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And while I will commend my good friend Dan Michaels at the Wall Street Journal for his coverage of NATO, listeners and readers should go to the Daily Telegraph's website and newspaper, because we're often ahead of them on the news. But more of that said later. Yeah, so on today's page one of the Telegraph, I have done a story after speaking to some US officials, and it's basically they're setting out more and more reasons why Ukraine is not going to be offered an invite when we stop in Washington, when their annual summit starts of NATO leaders on July the 9th next week. So we'll be there. And I'm going. I think a member of our lobby team is going with potentially Keir Starmer, a new prime minister. And I'm sure Tony and our US bureau will also be on the ground. So we'll have lots of coverage. But yeah, to this story. So essentially, Ukraine is going to be told it's too corrupt to join NATO at this moment. The alliance will request that Ukraine carries out additional steps before membership talks can progress, and that's from a senior official in the US State Department. This position will be set out in writing in NATO's communique. This is a little document, it's a grand document where the leaders all basically sign off, and it's signed off by consensus. So it's basically every 32 alliance leaders will have to sit down and hammer it out. And this is what the senior US State Department official said in response to my question about how is Ukraine doing when it comes to handling its corruption sort of reforms. And they said, we have to take a step back and applaud everything that Ukraine has done in the name of reforms over the past 2 years. As they continue to make those reforms, we want to commend them. We want to talk about additional steps that need to be taken, particularly in the area of anti-corruption. It is a priority for many of us around the table. So you'll note back to the Joe Biden interview with Time magazine, and he went on about, I'm not going to back NATOization of Ukraine, but he also said, when I was a vice president, when I was a senator, I spent time in Ukraine and I noticed the corruption. So this is something that has been hot on the thinking of in America, that which is interesting because the Americans are very pro-Ukrainian, they want to help, but they also have overlaps with countries that aren't so supportive, like Hungary, who have used the corruption argument in the EU debate and at NATO as well. So let's break this down and have a look at what we were basically looking at. So traditionally, there has been well-founded concerns of corruption and graft inside Ukraine's military. Procurement is seen as a major issue given the reputation there has been for officials taking bribes in exchange for defence contracts. And I don't say that as an assumption. It's not me looking at and slagging off Ukraine. President Zelensky has been hot on this. I was speaking to someone senior in NATO the other week, and they said that ever since Andrei Yermak assumed the role of the president's number one aide, he had been working round with Western allies. And this is before talk of NATO membership. This is before for the full-scale invasion. He'd been saying, look, we are trying to sort ourselves out. So these reforms aren't just a response to the war and the invasion by Russia. And you have to look at the numerous decisions Zelensky and his administration have taken in sacking defence officials in recent months, years, and they're often linked to issues like buying food, uniform, etc., other items for the armed forces. Ultimately, while he wasn't accused of this corruption, this is why former Defence Minister Alexei Reznikov was removed from post. So in a NATO context, because this obviously also is a problem in the EU context, but I will focus on NATO because this is what we're reporting on. What is being done by Ukraine and its NATO allies to overcome this hurdle? So it's been given what is known as an annual national programme, which is a document often broken down into its acronym ANP, that sets out the necessary reforms needed by any country wanting to join NATO that basically need to be carried out before that's possible. So Dmytro Kuleba, the Ukrainian foreign minister, recently joined a meeting of NATO counterparts where he delivered a presentation on ANP progress. So sources inside the alliance tell me that ministers, and this is the word that were used, felt really good, end quote, about what they're being told in terms of progress being made by Ukraine. But that's still not enough, according to them. So when we get into there is going to be a statement, we believe it's going to be multiple paragraphs, but it's not massive on Ukraine. It's going to reaffirm, hasn't it, as Francis was speaking about, that Ukraine's future lies inside NATO. It's not going to offer any concrete steps, which Tony Diver, our US editor, and I have been reporting on in terms of timetables being offered. There are still question marks over the irreversibility of that. So the US, Germany are slightly worried that offering the term irreversibility could be seen as an escalation. It could be a step too far. There are some talking about, is it wise to basically hand out an invite when NATO membership could be used as a bargaining chip to in future peace talks with Vladimir Putin? So there's lots of debates going on. But one thing is going to be made clear is no invite, and Ukraine is going to have to do more work on anti-corruption. So one example of this, because there has been a lot of sort of work undergoing about how Ukraine and NATO are working together to overcome this. So it's not, don't see this as some sort of grand snub. It's actually, they're just saying, look, for the moment, you still don't reach the standards. As much as you're our ally, you're a friend, you're a partner, and we want you to join NATO, we can't just offer you an open card because of the invasion, an open ticket, essentially. So one example that was put to me by a US defense official who said it's going unnoticed is there is a degree of defense capacity building, so operability, work, looking at how Ukraine can bring its kit up to scratch to a NATO standard, as we like to call it. But also, while doing that, making sure there is accountability across government for these decisions. So one of the criticisms of post-Soviet militaries is there isn't enough civilian control over the military, and that is a key aspect of NATO militaries. They are run by civilians. They're not run by generals making decisions. The generals are given orders by their civilian masters, and then they execute those orders. And this is a quote from the US defense official. We've just come to the conclusion of a defense procurement reform initiative with Ukrainians. So, to break that down, they've basically drawn up a plan of what Ukraine has to do to basically meet the defense procurement standards inside NATO. And they also think, while it won't guarantee instant NATO membership, it will open up, basically allow ambitions, it will generate greater investment. So you look at every time a country has signed a bilateral security arrangement with Ukraine, they've done sort of joint defense production, co-production. So it basically, by doing this defense procurement, it will allow outside companies. We look at like Germany's Rheinmetall, there's various French companies looking to invest in the country. BAE Systems, the British defence conglomerate, is looking to open offices and factories potentially. So basically they say these reforms will really help generate the necessary investment to build stuff inside Ukraine. That's not going to happen organically, this defense official says, unless there is a greater degree of fidelity and trust and credibility in the systems. That's something NATO has been doing quietly under the radar that helps them get closer to membership. So yeah, closer to membership, but it's also all about investment, basically boosting the economy so Ukraine can stand on its own 2 feet. Given the hit that its wartime economy has taken, lack of production, its men are fighting on the front line rather than working in factories, etc. Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting story. It's the first sort of time anyone's really outlined that the communique is going to contain sort of reference to Ukraine must do more in the fight against anti-corruption. And I'll stop there. Has anyone got any questions on that?
Yeah, no, that's fascinating, Joe. Thank you for talking us through it. It's quite complex and you summed it up really nicely. I guess the question I wrote down fairly early on was, to what extent, I think you've answered it, but it'd be good to just do this, to summarise it briefly. But to what extent do you think this is fobbing off the Ukrainians? And to what extent do you think it's a very serious, no, you will be in, but you really do have to do X, Y, Z?
So that was the initial idea of fobbing off was actually my question to this US official. I was like, are you using corruption as an excuse not to offer an invite, or sort of this alleged corruption, the reform's not going far enough so far, because there are fears that granting Ukraine NATO membership or even an invite for once the war is over is going to be seen as escalation in Moscow? I think what's quite clear is, and actually Ben Wallace summed this up quite nicely before he stepped down at the last summit in Vilnius. He said, look, none of us around the table are going to allow Ukraine to join while there is a war still going on because of Article 5. So, but once it ends, that's something we can look at very quickly. So actually, I don't think it's fobbing off because Ukraine still isn't in that space yet, but it's basically NATO is holding Ukraine's hand in making sure that these standards are met. So I don't think it's fobbing off. It's actually like saying, look, you're doing really well. Like what you're doing while you're running a wartime government and you're actually managing to do these reforms, which sometimes take decades for countries not at war. It's amazing. It's like, great work. Well done, guys. But you still have to do a little bit more. And actually, I think by outlining these steps, that actually adds to the element of, look, there are concrete steps. So it's not going to be an invite. It's not going to be a timeline. But actually, we're saying we're giving you some guidance on how to do this. So it's an interesting debate between the two. I'm sure there are some countries, Hungary, for instance, which opposes membership of both the EU and NATO for Ukraine, has said basically raised corruption concerns. But we know that there's probably some exterior motives behind that because Viktor Orban is seen as the closest Kremlin ally inside the EU and NATO. But yes, it's an interesting conundrum. But I'd say, as I said earlier, I don't want people to see this as a snub towards Ukraine. I want this to be seen as almost it's a hand-holding exercise and a sort of a helping step along. Like, let's guide you in softly rather than sort of snub you altogether.
Thanks, Joe. Francis here. I just really interesting reflecting on this key issue of NATO membership for Ukraine in the long term. And I think it's just, I'll come to the question in a moment, but I think it's interesting reflecting on the history of this because, of course, there were several instances before the war that NATO, as we talked about, 2008 communique there, said that at some point NATO membership will be given to Ukraine. Now, that was really seen as a wise thing to do back then. It was seen as something that was saying to Ukraine, we consider you a friend, we consider you an ally, we want to help you build a democracy and an economy that can one day merge with our own. I think there would be now a different perspective offered, which is that what that did was it basically fired the starting gun for Russia to start thinking, well, hang on a minute, if they're going to be becoming inevitably part of NATO, before they get boots on the ground, before they become too closely aligned, too closely tied, we need to invade and we need to plan properly for an invasion. And it seems that is exactly what they did over the subsequent years and indeed decade. So I think that's one aspect of this that's not really very often talked about, is that if you actually look at the history of these kind of vague statements of intent, then quite often what that actually does is sow discord further down the line. What's actually arguably far more powerful is being assertive and saying, we will give you it by, the end of the year or something like that, that then at the very least doesn't give a long run-in for powers like Russia to then be able to plan accordingly. But I wonder, Joe, and here's the question, I wonder, do you get a sense in Brussels and to those people that you speak about related to NATO that basic and major mistakes were made in the run-up to the war in Ukraine, particularly with regard to NATO assurances? Or is there still a sort of feeling that they got it generally right and it's just Russia that's decided to do something that was unpredicted here? I'm just interested in the general mood music and whether you're seeing that sense of an acceptance that a mistake was made. Because if you don't, then I think that's quite telling.
So there's two schools of thought, two tracks of thinking on this. It depends on where you're from on the European continent. So if you look at the Balts, the Poles, other Eastern European governments and people inside those governments, officials, politicians, whether they're elected or appointed, they would actually use the thing, look, we didn't do enough before the invasion to stop the invasion. We look at that moment back in Bucharest, when was that, 15, 16 years ago, 2008, when Vladimir Putin was actually in Bucharest at this meeting. And I remember he basically talked to Angela Merkel, talked to George Bush, the US president at the time. I think he described to George Bush, this is a source, I can't remember where I read it, one of the American newspapers, that he told George Bush that he didn't consider Ukraine to be a real state. So yeah, there are lots of misgivings around how that was handled. If you're a Bolt, if you're a Pole, you think, blimey, 2008, before sort of Crimea, so in the wake of Georgia, so the warning signs were there. There was Russia was naturally an aggressor again. It was invading sovereign territories and going, they would say, we've not done enough. We should have done more. We could have done something in 2008. We could have done something in Vilnius. We could have done something in Madrid even. There's moments in time where Ukraine could have been, well, actually Madrid, Vilnius after the invasion, but 2008, other times, 2014 even, there's like sort of times where we could have done more as an alliance. But then you look at other countries, more middle ground, more impacted by the fear of escalation with Moscow, that would say, look, we've done enough. But we can't help that Vladimir Putin is a sort of a madman hell-bent on causing death and destruction. But now we've got to step up to the plate. Now that's happening. They were happy with what they did. They wanted to keep her sort of ties with Russia open because they saw it as some sort of deconfliction method. But yeah, so I guess we'll let the academics theorize over that, or our listeners can decide who's on the right side of history when it comes to that argument, but both still exist.
Thanks, Joe. Yes, one for historians. And just you speak about listeners and their thoughts on this. And I want to thank listeners who've fed in their reflections, as ever, via the email address and via social media. One that caught my eye was reflecting on the fact that too often when we're talking about accepting Ukraine into NATO, we don't really consider the consequences of not doing so in the short to medium term. And of course, there are dangers that, depending on what happens over the longer term, that larger parts of Ukraine become absorbed into Russia or annexed illegally. And as a result of that, those resources could be then harnessed against NATO. So a NATO with Ukraine in, or partially in, is a very different NATO than one where Ukraine has been defeated or cut in two, say, because in that situation, you'd have a much more emboldened Russia that would be able to cleave off certain other NATO countries using hybrid warfare and seek to destabilize them, seek to try and have politicians elected in them who might be more favourable to Moscow. And it would indeed, as we did in the essay series a few weeks ago, it was Lillian Bivings of the Kyiv Independent that wrote the piece that was reflecting on the fact that if you've got control of the Ukrainian economy, its grain reserves, its vital metals, its weapons productions facilities, then that immediately gives huge power to Russia over NATO in some regards. Not saying it would be able to be on equal par with it, of course not, but it would have a lot more suddenly accumulated that it could utilise against NATO. So again, just an interesting counterfactual here is I think a lot of the conversations around NATO often assume that, well, Ukraine at some point will get in and it will be mostly Ukraine intact. But what if, actually, for Ukraine to remain intact, we need them to become a member of NATO in the short to medium term, not keep kicking the can down the road? And we need to be decisive, and we need to set a clear message to Putin and the Kremlin and other powers that the kind of activity that they have carried out in carrying out a genocidal war in Ukraine is not acceptable and will be punished with the complete opposite of what they intended. So one for the future, as we were saying, Joe.
Well, thank you, Francis and Joe. Joe, before we go to our final updates and final thoughts, I know you wanted to touch on Viktor Orban's visit to Ukraine. Was there anything you wanted to add to our reporting from yesterday?
Yeah, so Francis covered it really well in the morning, but things started to break after we had been live. And just a quick run through. Viktor Orban, in quite a provocative gesture, essentially called for a ceasefire with Russia while standing alongside Zelensky in Kyiv at the press conference. This is what Orban had to say. I asked the president to think about whether we could reverse the order and speed up peace talks by making a ceasefire first. A ceasefire connected to a deadline would give a chance to speed up peace talks. I explored this possibility with the president, and I'm grateful for his honest answers and negotiation. Yes, look, basically Orban's idea is let's freeze the current battlefield lines and then basically negotiate over that, which the large scale thinking on this idea, especially from Kyiv, but also its more ardent Western backers, is that by doing that, you basically hand Vladimir Putin the chance to cede a load of territory that is occupied. I think current estimations are about 18% of Ukraine is currently occupied by Russia. So by essentially a ceasefire first method, you're giving him that 18% of land and then opening negotiations. It's not a strong hand, but it is opposite to what Ukraine's peace plan is envisaging, which he basically, his plan states that Ukraine should only start talks once Russia has withdrawn its forces from Ukraine as recognized under its 1991 borders. That's the entire Donbas, Crimea, and then talks can start. Obviously, that's a maximalist approach. It's an interesting one there. So, but actually what I get a sense out of is that this actually really did help. There's been lots of incidents where Hungary has blocked, vetoed, delayed Ukrainian support. This was Viktor Orban's first trip to Ukraine, definitely since the war, but also for a long time. I think since 2014 was his last visit, and that was to see the president whose name has slipped out of my head, who oversaw the crackdown on Maidan protesters, or that pro-Russian who's now fled off and playing hand in hand with Putin. So yeah, it's a really interesting meeting. Let's wait and see if it actually brings any successes. Is Viktor Orban going to use his role as the head of the EU's rotating presidency for the next 6 months to actually help Ukraine? Because there's been some sort of doubts over that, but he is basically promising to solve the challenges that the EU faces. And he said that's why my first trip was to Kyiv, because that's seen as one of the main areas of concern from the EU. Andrei Yermak, who's the head of Ukraine's presidential office, the chief of staff, national security advisor, basically Zelensky's right arm. He said of the meeting, "We did a lot for this visit. It is important to talk about the future of Europe, security, international law, and the peace formula." So I don't think the talks weren't as rubbish as some would have predicted. Previous talks between Zelensky and Orban on their margins have almost looked like shouting matches, where Zelensky is complaining and moaning at an Orban who's just rolling his eyes. But they seem to be more fitting. There was handshakes and stuff. So yeah, good news, I hope. Maybe a softening on Hungary's approach, but let's wait and see.
Well, thank you, Joe and Francis. Just some breaking news from me. We've been hearing rumours of this all morning, but we hadn't reported it yet. So just coming in now onto the Telegraph live blog. But Russia has claimed it has captured a district in the key hilltop city of Chasiv Yar in eastern Ukraine, where, as we know, Moscow's troops have been relentlessly advancing for months. Capturing the city close to Bakhmut would allow Russia to threaten crucial Ukrainian supply lines and mount further offensives throughout the region. Just some more detail, the Defence Ministry claimed that its troops had, quote, liberated the Novi district of Chasiv Yar. That's a neighbourhood on the eastern edge of the city. Moscow's claim was repeated, well, at least I wouldn't say repeated, but it's certainly things are moving by the Ukrainian deep state Telegram channel, which runs its own, large-scale map of the entire war. And we know that, we think that Deep State does have links to the Ukrainian army. Looking at Deep State now, these arrows have been popping up all morning. We see an advance towards New York, south of Chasiv Yar. We see advances seemingly confirmed by Deep State towards the eastern edges of Chasiv Yar. I didn't want to bring this to you. I wanted to leave this till tomorrow when we can have a bit more time to look at it. There's also arrows in the south as well, advances towards the key highway between Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar. This is the kind of thing that I know that Roland Oliphant and Dom have been talking about for months. So we'll have more information for you tomorrow, but it does look as if these claims by Russia's defense ministry do have some truth to them. Basically, the Russians are slowly moving forward in key parts of Donbas. Well, let's go to our final thoughts for now, and we'll bring you more on that tomorrow when we can verify more and report more. But Francis Dearnley, can I come to you first for your final thoughts?
Well, thanks, David. Yeah, really interesting hearing those updates. And as you say, there'll be lots more reflection, I think, on that tomorrow. I need to look at the maps myself and try and get a grip on it because things are just so fast moving at the moment. Every day you're out of date. So hence why it's so valuable, hopefully, doing a daily podcast on this. Anyone who's trying to cover it week by week, it's just impossible at the moment. But yes, so final thought-wise, as we've talked about for a while now, it is tomorrow a general election here in the United Kingdom. Don't worry, I'm not going to bore you to tears about it. I just wanted to flag that it does seem, as I talked about yesterday, that it will be the end of 14 years of Conservative government here. Government, of course, that began in terms of the party running things with David Cameron as Prime Minister, now Foreign Secretary, and he has written an opinion piece for us where he reflects basically on what has happened during his time as Foreign Secretary, but also offering some insights from before that, from his time as Prime Minister. And I should say, of course, this is a piece that is mainly designed to say vote Conservative, but it has some interesting snippets in it. And he doesn't pull his punches in terms of how important I think he sees foreign affairs as being in the short to long term. And as a result, why he thinks that stability is important at this moment. But of course, he would say that. So to quote him, he says, "The global picture is going to remain challenging for some time. It's likely that international affairs will top the agenda during the next 5 years. The Prime Minister our country chooses will have to spend a great time of effort working with allies to combat the threats we face." Now, I mentioned that first of all because I don't think we've really seen defence being a major campaign subject in this country. And that will be interesting, depending on what happens next, whether that will be seen as insane by future historians. But he also says, "The world today is more dangerous than it has been in my lifetime, and much more so than when I became Prime Minister in 2010. The invasion of Ukraine, conflict in the Middle East, ships attacked in the Red Sea, wars across Africa. We're faced with an axis of authoritarian states and hostile actors working together to threaten international security. The warning lights on the global dashboard are flashing red, and we cannot ignore them, not least because instability abroad is also a threat here at home." Then he goes on, he talks about, of course, examples of how things have changed over the last 10 years or so. He hosted the NATO summit in Wales in 2014. That was where the 2% commitment of GDP spending on defence was made, something that Britain was one of the only countries at the time in NATO that did that alongside with the United States. Now there are far more members who are at 2%, although, of course, the conversation has moved on to whether that is anywhere near enough. Many are calling for 2.5 to 3%. But as I say, a conversation for another time. He ends the piece by saying we need more emphasis on our security, not less. Our allies and adversaries must both see that we are serious about stepping up. We need to use everything in our toolbox. We have to build up formidable sanctions programs targeting the hostile states, terrorist organizations, criminal gangs, and others who seek to challenge our democracy and an economic system. So as I say, I point that out to listeners because it might well be an interesting one and a final page turned on 14 years of Conservative government where we enter a new era in this country under Labour, the first time since Tony Blair and Gordon Brown were Prime Minister, which will no doubt offer some different perspectives on the foreign affairs landscape. So quite a nice piece in which to wrap that up and see how things have changed over the last decade or so.
Thank you very much, Francis. Looking forward to hearing your reaction to whatever the general election here in the United Kingdom brings us tomorrow on Friday. Joe Barnes, can we have your final thought, please?
Yeah, I was just, after you gave us the breaking news on the potential Chasif Yar things, I thought I'd dig out a piece that Roland and I wrote back in May 16th. Give it a search on Telegraph website. It's headlined, "What Russia Really Wants from Its Summer Offensive." But then I noticed that actually, Roland had been on the Battle Lines podcast to analyse what it's be a war reporter watching Civil War. And it just brought me a chuckle because at the weekend, I got asked this by someone whose mum works as a photographer in hostile environments. They were like, "Joe, have you seen this film?" And I went, "Yeah." And then my girlfriend interrupted and basically said I was shouting insurance all the way through as these people were running around an active war zone without their helmet on. But yeah, back to this Chasif Yar piece. Sorry, it's a bit of a sort of a not fluffed altogether, because I'm just looking at this and reading back from this piece that Roland and I wrote, nearly 2 months ago now. So you can look at what Russia's plan is. You take Chasif Yar, which is basically a tiny town perched on an upland between Bak and the Krasny-Terets valleys. Capturing it provides this foothold on a plateau, putting Russian artillery in the range of Terets Valley towns and giving the FPV drones free rein to basically terrorize a road known as the H20. But then also the occupying this high ground gives them the chance to basically cut the T0504 highway, which is known as the Highway of Life, basically Ukraine's main highway that supplies from, I think, all the way to Dnipro into Donetsk city, but it was used for, it became famous that it was that main supply route, and once that was gone, that was cut off. So this is really capturing that, could complete the capture of Kostantivka and other sort of Donetsk region towns. So yeah, really this moment is obviously going to be quite scary. I can imagine the Ukrainians are going to push back hard on this. They don't like admitting that they have lost little pockets of land. This is a sort of just a me theorizing, but potentially is this actually starting to feel the impact of the Kharkiv offensive, where I think most people are in the mind that was meant as a distraction to pull Ukrainian forces from elsewhere. Has it enabled Russia to basically gain a bit more momentum in sort of the Donetsk, Donbas regions of the war and the front line? So yeah, really interesting. I'm going to go away and properly look into it, pour over the maps, and I'm sure we can talk over it at some other time in more detail.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our world affairs newsletter which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Giles Gear, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.